Ned Kelly was born in 1854, at a time of Goldfields Rebellion, a time when the gold rush dream was tarnishing. He grew up in the heart of a low-key land war, fought out in the post-gold rush years between squatters, sheep and cattle barons, and selectors, small farmers the colony's government was trying to settle among the squatters' holdings. In this conflict, police supposedly played the role of peacekeepers, but inevitably favoured the men with financial and political muscle, the squatters. Ned was the son of an Irish convict, Red Kelly, transported to Van Diemen's Land for pig stealing. After Red's death when Ned was 12, his mother, Ellen, daughter of Irish migrants, brought her 7 children to northeastern Victoria, where several members of her family had settled. Ned's uncles and cousins were often in trouble with the police for horse stealing, stock theft and brawling. The centuries-old conflicts of Ireland were mirrored in this vast new land. The law was that of England. Many of the men who enforced it were Irish, members of a force modelled on the loathed Royal Irish Constabulary. Squatters stepped into the role of the English and Anglo-Irish landholders. Ellen Kelly and her children had settled on the 11-Mile Creek near Greta, a district with a higher than normal proportion of Irish farmers whose small selections flanked the broad acres of some of the Northeast's most powerful squatters. Battle lines were drawn. The police watched and waited. Almost inevitably, Ned was drawn into the squatter-selector land war, now heightened by a series of disastrous seasons. With his American stepfather, George King, Ned formed a horse-stealing gang and carried out an extraordinary number of thefts, climaxing with a major haul from a hated squatter. While the gang split up, a one-time friend of Ned's, Constable Fitzpatrick, took a fancy to 14-year-old Kate Kelly. Hearing that 16-year-old Dan Kelly was wanted for horse stealing, Fitzpatrick jumped at the chance to visit the Kelly homestead. Dan, who was innocent of the charge, was happy to go with Fitzpatrick until the young constable made a half-drunken pass at Kate. Dan flew at him and a brawl erupted as Ned arrived. Fitzpatrick rode back to his station that night with a minor wrist injury, swearing Ned Kelly had shot him. As Ned and Dan rode off as fugitives, the police arrested Mrs. Kelly and her 3-day-old baby, with a son-in-law and a friend who were supposedly present when Fitzpatrick was wounded. Charged with attempted murder, apparently because she'd knocked Fitzpatrick's helmet over his eyes with a fire shovel, Mrs. Kelly was sentenced to 3 years hard labour. The two men were each sentenced to 6 years. The Kelly boys offered to give themselves up if their mother was released. The offer was ignored. So, camped at a hut in the remote Wombat Ranges, they tried to raise money for a new trial, working a gold mine and a pot whisky still. Meanwhile, the police prepared to trap the fugitives between two parties, one heading south from Greta, the other striking north into the ranges from Mansfield. Ned and Dan heard of boasts by one of the Greta party that he would kill Ned Kelly and put a revolver in his hand to make it look as though there had been a fight. The Mansfield party was equipped with specially made straps to sling bodies on a pack horse. The Kelly brothers waited, poorly armed, as storm clouds gathered above the Wombat Ranges. The gang's most formidable enemies joined the police pursuit the month after the Jerilderie hold-up, 6 Aboriginal troopers on loan from the Queensland government. Usually called black trackers, they were trained, uniformed and armed as mounted police, raised as a special force to combat the formidable and warlike natives of Queensland's Palmer River district. They were brilliant trackers, superb horsemen, fierce fighters, the only men in the police pursuit capable of matching the Kelly gang in their mastery of bushcraft. Ned called them 6 little demons, and with the coming of winter retreated above the snow line to evade them. Fortunately for the gang, the leaders of the police pursuit never gave the Aboriginal troopers a free hand and hampered their work with unwieldy search parties. So the pursuit dragged on through 1879 and police frustration grew. They had already tried locking up Kelly supporters for months without trial. This time, they came up with an even more insidious ploy. No friend or relative of the gang was allowed to take up land in the Kelly country. Farmers were denied the means to make a living in their home district among friends and family. Now, the gang's outlawry was no longer an adventurous romp. Ned saw himself as responsible for the plight of these men. To help them, he must challenge the very basis of such unjust laws. The Kelly outlawry became a rebellion, with a wild plan to make 4 suits of armour from plough mouldboards and lead a little army of supporters in forging a republic of northeastern Victoria. The republic was a mad dream, as mad as the idea of making armour. But in the early months of 1880, it was happening. The gang were on the verge of releasing all their prisoners when Joe Byrne ran back into the pub yelling, "The train's coming!" Chaos. The gang putting on their armour, dousing fires and lamps among 40 frightened and confused men, women and children. When the train pulled up at the Glenrowan station, the inn was in darkness, its front shadowed by the moon in mid-heaven behind it. The police charged forward and shots blasted at them from the dark veranda. The police leader was hit, and in a storm of gunfire, Ned was badly wounded moments later. His left arm shattered by 4 wounds, his right foot drilled from toe to heel. A panicky Kelly supporter fired 2 rockets to gather the little rebel army. As terrified civilians lay on the floor of the inn, below the storm of bullets shredding its flimsy walls, Ned limped out through the half-formed police cordon to turn back the men riding to join him. His plan had misfired. This was no fight of theirs. Then Ned struggled back to the inn. Already 3 civilians were mortally wounded. He arrived in time to see his mate Joe Byrne killed. Ned called the 2 boys, Dan Kelly and Steve Hart, and tried to lead them to safety. In the nightmarish confusion, they didn't follow. Out in the bush, after bleeding from major wounds for more than 2 hours, weighed down by more than 50 kilos of armour on a freezing night, Ned fainted. Police reinforcements arrived by train and on horseback, completely surrounding the inn, cutting Ned off from Dan and Steve. So, as dawn approached, he armed himself with 3 revolvers and gathered strength for one last attempt at rescue. The sun was just rising through ground mist and drifts of gunsmoke when something came lurching among the trees towards the bullet-shattered Glenrowan Inn. It seemed huge, unhuman, a metal monster with an oilskin coat draped over its shoulders. A trooper yelled a warning, fired a shot. No effect. The thing drew a revolver, fired back, and all hell broke loose as Ned Kelly, all but unconscious from loss of blood, attacked 34 police and tried to drive them away from the side of the inn. It lasted for nearly half an hour, this impossible fight. When Ned at last fell from critical blood loss, 17 bullets had hit his armour and he had suffered 28 gunshot wounds in arms, legs, hands, feet and both groins. The final wounds from 2 barrels of buckshot blasted at point-blank range into his unarmoured legs. The police removed his armour and took him to the railway station where a doctor pronounced that he was dying. Ned had no will to live, but he was too tough to die. It all dragged on for another 7 hours. Dan and Steve released the last of the civilians and refused to surrender. Eventually, in mid-afternoon, a constable set a light to the hotel, and as flames raced through it, a brave priest ran into the blazing building. In a back room, he saw the bodies of Dan and Steve, heads pillowed on sacking, armour and a dead dog beside them. Joe's stiffened corpse and a dying civilian were carried clear, and the pub became a funeral pyre for the 2 youngest members of the gang. Ned's conviction launched a remarkable campaign to gain him a reprieve from death. Huge public meetings were held, a deputation met the colony's governor, petitions were printed and circulated all over Victoria and into the Riverina. Eventually, petition forms with 34,424 signatures were presented to the government. Another 28,000 were said to have been collected within days. Reprieve was refused. Ned's execution was set for the 11th of November, only 3 days away. Ned wrote a series of letters to the governor stating his case, never pleading for mercy, asking only that his body be given to friends for burial in consecrated ground. The request was ignored. Ned was prepared for execution on the morning of the 11th of November as a huge crowd gathered outside the Melbourne jail. Relatives and friends remained at Melbourne's Robert Burns Hotel. Ned's mother, serving her sentence over the Fitzpatrick case, was at work in the prison laundry that morning.